What is going on, everybody? Sorry we were a little bit behind today. Gary and I have had a crazy awesome, but very crazy busy morning. So Gary should be hopping on here soon, and then we'll kind of get to our main conversation, which is going to be why now is the best time to build a business. The reason that's our topic, by the way, is because in a lot of the conversations that we have on, say, Twitter Spaces or on some of our previous YouTube lives, Gary will often mention how every time that he has started a business or even like taken a job, it's been in an economic downturn. And with the Fed doing rate cuts, with 50-point rate cuts, there's normally a sign that we're going to be in some pretty bad times, right? That's normally not a good thing. And the debate that we had last Thursday, for those of you who were on our Twitter Spaces, which, by the way, 5 p.m. tonight, if you haven't attended our Twitter Spaces, you should. We'll be doing them again tonight, probably going over some of the markets and some of what we're going to talk about today. But one thing we always talk about is if the Fed is reactive or proactive. So what does that mean? Most of the time, everybody thinks that the Fed is proactive in that they're getting ahead of the market and they're setting the interest rates to, say, for example, prevent a recession, right? That's what a lot of people think. Oh, the Fed is cutting rates now to prevent a bad economic downturn. In reality, more often than not, potentially always, the Fed is reactive, which means we're already in a downturn. So now they're doing the rate cuts. And I don't know if you guys listen to economists like Jeffrey Schneider, and Chris Hanks did a really good job of kind of discussing this on our last show. And then even when we were talking on Twitter Spaces with Joe Calsari, talking about how, the Fed is almost always reactive. So the Fed responds to the market. And the Fed responds by trying to, loosen up the monetary supply, so to speak, and allow money to flow. But you can kind of get a sense that, one, rate hikes and rate cuts don't always work. So now what the Fed, I think, is seeing is bad jobs numbers, bad jobs reports, which I think are much worse than they're reporting. I think Powell admitted last week that actually the Federal Reserve counts illegal immigrant jobs as jobs created. So that to me is fascinating because I wonder how they even calculate that. You would think a lot of those jobs are off the books, but then two, a lot of those jobs are different than typical jobs in the sense that there's less regulation, so they're probably underpaid. It's probably different in the way that they affect the economy because of how underpaid they are, and like the different systems in which they have to get work. So when I heard that, I was like, okay, so these numbers are already kind of cooked, right? So that's not a good thing at all. And then we saw that now, and I'd love to have some of my trading buddies comment on the fact that now I think altcoin season is starting to pick up, right? I saw today in the headlines, Ethereum outperforms Bitcoin as Token 2049 concludes, which, by the way, if you guys were at Token 2049, feel free to hit me up. I heard it was a really good conference. I heard it was really exciting. We were very tempted to go, but flying to Singapore when you have as much work as Gary and I is pretty tough, right? And I know there's a huge network at 2049, but it was just tough to make the time to do so. But all that being said, it's interesting that now it seems like the altcoin season is potentially approaching, right? Which most of our audience and most of you guys are Bitcoiners, Bitcoin maxis. Gary and I will talk about that, where Gary's invested in things like Doge or Solana, but like that doesn't mean he views them as quote unquote valuable products. It's more like betting, like just, Doge is a bet on Elon. Solana, I think, is just a bet on like the volatility in the market as a whole. If you want to go down some of those roads and kind of figure out, okay, so why would you purchase like any of these shit coins at all? Which, and I have buddies who do very well trading and buying the highs and buying the dips in those coin categories. But I certainly do not. That's why one thing that I always talk about is I'm a terrible trader, and I just buy and hold because I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm bad at, and I am bad at trading. Chris Inks and I will talk about that all the time of how bad of a trader I am. And that's, really, it's not because I've made bad trades. Buying into Bitcoin has been one of the best trades in the world to me since I've been buying since 2016, 2017. But like when I try to invest in small cap tokens and try to make a quick buck, it just never ends up working out very well for me because it's true. I end up being the exit liquidity. So, and I always joke, I think I had a Twitter post that did pretty well the other day where I was like, hey guys, I bought Bitcoin. So now it's a good time to buy because the price is going to dip. And the price did dip after I bought, by the way. The price did dip. So I was like, yeah, of course. And some interesting political facts that I'll get over, and then we'll get into kind of our main topic. Kamala Harris is apparently now saying in a private roundtable event that she went to that her administration is going to do everything possible to support digital assets as well as AI, but didn't really, they unsubscribed us from Gary's channel. Ridiculous. Did they really unsubscribe you, K-Up? If you have proof of that, you should send it to us. DM me on Twitter because that's very interesting if they unsubscribed you. That's actually really important information for us because that hasn't been reported yet. So far, everything seems to be good with our YouTube channel, but if we're starting to get shadow banned or if anything fishy is happening, we definitely want to know. And I'm the one who manages all that. So definitely follow up with me because that's not good if they just randomly unsubscribe you. But Kamala Harris kind of coming out and being supportive of digital assets. But one, it really doesn't matter at this point at all in the campaign cycle. People are going to start voting in the next 3 weeks. I think early voting in Pennsylvania starts like midway through October, as well as in some other swing states, by the way, because you start to get mail-in voting. If you haven't made your choice by now, like 99% of Americans have, they always talk about these swing voters, but 99% of Americans know before election day who they're going to vote for. And Trump was at a dinner in his house. I think it was Mar-a-Lago or it was in Jupiter Sunday. And that was part of his NFT dinner. And that was more crypto focused. And that was also, funny enough, surrounding Bitcoin and the crypto issue. So I think the most fascinating takeaway is the fact that Kamala is having to move to be more centrist, although every time she talks about crypto and Bitcoin, she's always mentioning that we need good regulations for Bitcoin and crypto. She's like, oh, I'm pro, Web3, pro Bitcoin, but I want to make sure there's consumer protections. It's like, okay, well, what consumer protections do you need? Like, obviously, I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But the fact that she always has to say that is a way for her to be like, okay, so I can crack down and use enforcement. Because Gary Gensler also always says, hey, guys, crypto is fine. We just need consumer protections. So he says that all the time, and we all know how bad he is. So for Kamala Harris to be saying the exact same thing is not a good sign. In the meantime, Trump was in New York last week buying burgers with Bitcoin. And then he just held a dinner where he was talking about, hey, potentially we can pay off the $35 trillion debt by investing in crypto. Very interesting statements, right? When you look at like what a politician says and you have to read in between the lines, which is really what you have to do in these political scenarios, Trump is still the dominant Bitcoin candidate in any way, shape, or form. And so if you are in the Bitcoin kind of crypto industry, it's very clear who your candidate really is. Now, if you don't like Trump for all the other reasons people don't like Trump, that's fine and that's fair and you can have that opinion. But you can't argue that he is not the most pro-Bitcoin, pro-crypto candidate in the race, as opposed to Kamala Harris. And you also see that, by the way, with J.D. Vance, his vice presidential running mate. And J.D. Vance is very close with Vivek, both of them on his team being very pro-Bitcoin. And then you have, what's up, Blockchain Basement? What's up, Chris? Chris, I was just talking about earlier how terrible of a trader I am, but now I'm just talking on the political side briefly. Good morning, guys. Blockchain Basement, always good to see you, by the way, dude. I know I need to come on your show again. I know we need to get Gary on your show. I know we've talked about that in the past, which we do need to make happen, absolutely. And then, Chris, we'll see you today at 5. Chris, I was just talking about actually something that we talked about last week where we were talking about whether the Fed is reactive or proactive. right, when it comes to the market. So I was just briefly ranting about that for a short period of time. But back to what I was talking as far as the campaign goes. By the way, if you guys want updated numbers, and I don't know if you've seen any of the polling, but we're 42 days away from the election now. We're September is this the last week of September? Pretty sure this is the last week of pretty much this is the last. September ends a week from today, right? And then we'll be in October. And then October is the final stretch, right? People are able to early vote 2 weeks into October. So the polling now matters more than anything else. I just saw on Twitter that Trump is polling, for example, 3 points ahead of Kamala Harris in Arizona. Whereas at this point in last election, Biden was polling 4 points ahead of Trump in Arizona. And then in 2016, when Trump won, he was polling like 1.2%. So this is actually the best polling for Trump that he's ever had. And then I don't know if you've seen some of the different statistics. I mean, for some of you guys that really like the math, can you trust the polls potentially? What are you expecting for an October surprise? October surprise, I'm super bad at predictions, by the way. For an October surprise, I don't know. And like, yeah, you're good. You're right, guys, in that you shouldn't necessarily trust polls. But polls, no individual poll is good. But taking all these different polls together kind of gives you an accurate story in the sense of like, where are we going and how are things changing? So, like, if the polls all the time said Kamala Harris is ahead by 10 points in every state, and then the next poll says Kamala Harris is ahead by only 6 points, and then the next poll said by 4 points, that's kind of telling you a story of like something's going on there where she's either losing momentum, for example, or voters are just dissatisfied. I'll give you an example of a poll that was kind of some gaslighting. And I made a TikTok on this. I saw a poll that said 70% of Black voters are voting for Kamala Harris, whereas 12% are voting for Donald Trump. So I want to pick this apart with you guys, actually. So remember these numbers. 70% of Black voters are voting for Kamala Harris, according to this poll, and only 12% are voting for Donald Trump. That poll makes it sound like it's a good thing for Kamala Harris, but it's actually an excellent poll for Donald Trump. I'll tell you why. Previous Republican candidates before Trump, and even Trump in 2016 when he ran, only had about 8% support among Black voters. So one, that's showing you there's a 4% increase for Donald Trump among Black voters in polling. But the real story is Kamala Harris. 70% of Black voters support Kamala Harris. That was really low, record low. So Obama had like 93%, I think, his first go round, then 90% his second go round. John Kerry had like 88%. Who else? Hillary Clinton had like 87%. So 70%, 87%. So 70% for Kamala Harris. You see that and you compare it to Trump, you go, oh, wow, that's awesome. Like, what great numbers. That's actually a terrible number. She is polling the worst any Democratic candidate has among Black voters in the past since 2000, right? Because I'm pretty sure actually it probably goes back previous to that because Clinton did really well with Black voters. Even Al Gore, I think, polled better than that. So you guys really have to understand, don't trust the polls, go out and vote. But like I said, like polls can sometimes be somewhat accurate, but then used for manipulation. So this poll, you see 70% for Kamala Harris, 12% for Donald Trump. You look at that on the surface and you go, oh, wow, Kamala Harris has the majority of Black voters. She must be doing well. Maybe she'll be able to, win Georgia. But then when you look at all the data shows that, hey, actually, she's doing the worst among Black voters than any Democratic presidential candidate has ever done, right? And that is not a good thing for her camp. And her people probably realize that. The media probably does not realize that, nor does the media want you to realize that, which is why they frame the polling in a specific way. But I would seriously, don't stray away from looking at the polls because they can be propaganda, but kind of to my point still, they can paint an accurate picture. and treat things very well. I think the current poll, if I go to Real Clear Politics rolling average, yeah, see, there's a New York Times Siena poll. Okay, so New York Times, wow, I wonder what their bias is. The New York Times is showing that Trump is a point ahead in Arizona. Actually, all the polls are saying he's ahead in Arizona, so that's interesting. So all the polls are saying he's ahead in Arizona. Let's see what the polls say in here. I can share my screen with you guys. Or the polls manipulated. So black voters are notorious for if they aren't excited about a candidate, they just stay home. Black voters and like what they call country voters, right? So people out in the sticks, think of people like in Iowa or in the country. Those two populations, when they aren't excited for a candidate, they just don't vote for them. What that means is, say only 70% of black voters are voting for Kamala Harris. That doesn't mean Trump gets 30%, right? Because there's going to be a lot of them who just don't vote at all, right? And that's really the big thing to see. Suarez, the Fed has absolutely zero reason to do an emergency rate cut. Don't waste time thinking it's a possibility. Absolutely zero reason. Yeah, and I feel like if the Fed did an emergency rate cut, that would screw the market, would it not? I mean, the fact that we even call it an emergency rate cut, like, I feel like that would do exactly what the Fed doesn't want to do, right? Things would have to be so dire for that to happen. Why wouldn't they just wait till the next quarter, right? And do it then. So I just don't see it. All right, let me share my screen with you guys. I'll show you guys some of the polling, and we can look at it together and just look at it as a story. And you guys can tell me if you like it or not. Let me pull up. There we go. Hike, not cut. Rates go up, the market would tank, but it would be very good for the economy. Yeah, the market. Yeah, I don't understand why they would do a rate cut at all, though. So you kind of lost me there. I mean, a rate hike. I don't understand why they would do a rate hike. So what's cool about Real Clear Politics is, so I'm looking at Arizona right now. And if we're looking at Arizona, and you guys can hopefully see that. You can see that Trump was killing Biden until boom, Kamala hops on stage. Kamala makes up the momentum. She looks like she could flip Arizona. Now it almost looks like we're returning to the mean because Trump's support is still high. But look, so the big thing for Biden was just voter enthusiasm was super low. It doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It seems that people are actually excited to vote for Kamala Harris. But if we go, Pennsylvania is a good example. So if we look at Pennsylvania, and one of the reasons Pennsylvania was interesting, by the way, is Biden was very well liked in Pennsylvania because of his Scranton ties. At least that's what people told you. Oh, Richard, what are you saying? Before a crash is when you should be building your new boat, not after. Otherwise, your corporate employer is going to be throwing you into open water with everyone else. Resurgence in entrepreneurship is how Americans take back their security and independence. Completely agree. The big question is, like, how do you innovate when everything's gone to zero, right? I'm not trying to be a doomer there, but it is tough, right? It's going to be very tough. Although, you don't have an option either. So to your point, Richard, I can tell you, of course, it's going to be hard, but you also don't have an option. So I think you will see a resurgence in entrepreneurship, unless the government decides, hey, we're just going to do mass handouts, and then you won't see a resurgence in entrepreneurship. You're going to see a resurgence in government debt and people on the government dole, right? I guess that's the alternative. The economy and jobs are doing what the Fed wants right now. The DXY dropping below 100 is not an issue for the Fed. We are entering a new liquidity cycle. The DXY will continue to drop as a result. Chris, remember that point for our Twitter Spaces later, a new liquidity cycle? Because I would like to know exactly what that means and dive into like what is a new liquidity cycle. Sammy, Chris should be a moderator. Blue Wrench. I don't know what Blue Wrench means, but absolutely love Chris. Guys, Chris will be on our show on our Twitter Spaces later today at 5. I know. Chris, if you want, if you're free, I'm happy to send you the link if you want to pop on and talk markets and maybe talk about some of this before the Twitter spaces. I'm certainly more than down. Let's see. Chris, there you go. Looking for a show. Chris, I just sent you an email if you want to talk about it a little bit. I'm more than down. Thoughts on P. Diddy? Always remember to put the address of the crypto wallets. I think we've covered most of our thoughts on P. Diddy, to be completely honest. Right now, we're just going to have to wait for the news cycle to clear, right? And then we'll know more about like what's going on with P. Diddy. But just real quick, guys, as you can see in Pennsylvania is probably like the tightest race. You see Trump slowly starting to get a bump, right? So this is what really matters, because if by the election time Trump's momentum is going upward and Kamal's is going downward, that's what could swing the state, and that's what's going to matter. Oh yeah, all good, Chris. And Yowzer, that's not how that works. Unless you mean in the chat as opposed to just doing it on the show. But let me go back. I'll show you guys one more thing. One more thing that I find really, really interesting is North Carolina. So for North Carolina, so fun fact, by the way, what makes North Carolina so interesting is North Carolina has more independent voters than I think any other state. And that's why if Trump wins North Carolina, I think that's a good indicator for him among independents in general. It's so funny how weird to me these polls are, by the way, because just look at how poorly Biden's doing. They've got at least a 5% gap, then boom, Biden withdraws, and then immediately Kamala closes that gap. Isn't that insane? Although, see, now look, you can see how even though they're close together, that gap is now opening back up with Trump's momentum going up and Kamala Harris's momentum going down. So once again, you have to realize, okay, even if you don't trust these polls, click make moderator. No, yeah, see, I'm on StreamYard, so I don't know what platform you use, but that's just not how that works on StreamYard. You're probably thinking like if we were on YouTube, but yeah, that's not how that works on StreamYard. If it is, then you just know more about StreamYard than I do, because there's literally just no option for me on there. But I digress. Let's go to North Carolina. And I don't know if you guys have been watching any of this stuff, but also I'll give you guys just one more tidbit, and then Chris will probably come up and we'll talk. This to me is a very big deal. The mayor of Hamtramck, however you say that, Michigan, Hamtramck. Michigan Mayor Amir Ghalib, a Democrat, endorsed Donald Trump for president. I'll not regret my decision no matter what the outcome would be, and I'm ready to face the consequences. Here's why this is crazy. This is a majority Muslim city. And if you do the numbers, and you look at the numbers behind some of the polling, by the way, there are about 200,000 Muslims in Michigan, about 200,000 Muslims in Minnesota, about 100,000 Muslims in Pennsylvania, and 100,000 Muslims in, I think, North Carolina. All of those communities could single-handedly flip any of those states. So if you have a mayor, a Democratic mayor from a majority Muslim city coming out and supporting Donald Trump, what does that tell you? Right? That tells you a lot. It tells you that more than likely, Trump could flip some of these blue wall states, right? And the reason I'm saying that is because, like, Trump won, I think it was Michigan, by just 20,000 votes in 2016. And then Kamala Harris, I mean, Biden, pretty much the same person though, right? Won Michigan or Wisconsin back with like 100,000 votes. Why do you think they're so focused on crypto and Bitcoin? Because they know the numbers in these swing states read just enough to where, hey, they could like literally swing the entire election. Because this election, one way you guys will know this election is done early, like if you want to know who's going to win, is if Trump wins Pennsylvania, the election's pretty much over, right? Like, I'm not even kidding. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, the election is literally over because there will be almost no path for Kamala Harris to get victory, right? That's how important Pennsylvania is. If Trump wins New Hampshire and loses Pennsylvania, he still has the path to victory, but he has to get something like Wisconsin, and he has to win Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, right? But that would all be a very, very tight race. I don't know if you guys have ever looked at previous election maps. It's actually very fascinating because Florida used to be the most important state, the state in which I reside. But then that flipped around because now Florida is so solid red. But then in the way that Florida turned red, Colorado turned blue. And so if you look at Bush, if you look at George Bush and the 2000 election, the map is completely different because George Bush didn't win Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, but all he needed, and he didn't even win Pennsylvania. You know what? I should just show you guys. Let me actually pull up George Bush map 2000. I'll show you guys. I mean, it's literally, it's crazy to think about. It's crazy to think about how much things have changed, right? When it comes to the electorate. All right, I want to expand this whole map. Let's see. All right, let me show you guys. Every poll I've seen on Twitter, whether by liberal conservatives, Trump at 70+%. Yeah, I know, but you have to remember, Twitter is like mostly conservative people, I think. So I don't know if Twitter is a great place to do polling. All right, check this out, guys. We kind of forget some of this stuff. Let me see. Can I pull up a bigger map? Because this is the contentious election. Blah, blah, blah. Pat Buchanan. I like Pat Buchanan a lot. Sites of the 2000 general election debates. Oh, interesting. They had 4 debates and we only get 1. Isn't that hilarious? All right, guys. So this was the map. Here's how crazy this is. George Bush won. George Bush won this election. And it's all because look at how different this is. He won Virginia and he won Colorado and he won Nevada. Now, Virginia is pretty solid blue. These blue wall states are now the new swing states. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are now the swing states. Whereas before, Florida used to be the swing state. And now Colorado is completely blue. All right, so let me just show you guys. I'll compare this to 2020 election map. It's crazy how quickly things change. I'll share this tab with you guys. We had 2 presidential debates up to now, not 1. Yeah, well, I mean, I know technically we had one with Biden and then we had one with Kamala Harris, but yeah, I've only counted that as 1 because it's only been 1 with the person who's running, right? So I don't know if I would really count that. Trump with Elon on X had 1 billion views. I believe Kamala and Oprah had 300,000. Iowa blue. Yeah, so check this out. Yeah, so in 2000, Iowa went blue, right? So this goes to show, and this is now over 20 years ago, right? 24 years ago to be exact, but how much things have changed and how much the electorate has changed. Let's go to the 2020 map. Check this out. This is the 2020 map, which almost returns to the normal, to the mean a little bit, right? The difference being, you know, they swept Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and Virginia. But the real key here, and this shows you just kind of how much of a game changer Trump is, when you go to the 2016 map. So we're going to compare the 2016 map with the George Bush 2000 map. All right, guys. Like, check this out. All right, let's go down. Down, 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 down. There we go. Look at how much Trump changed the map. Like, this is what's crazy. So, once again, we're going to look at 2000. Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, all blue. Iowa's blue, right? And on the flip side, Nevada's red, Colorado's red, Virginia's red. And then Florida was the big swing state, right? Florida was the big swing state. Now we move to Trump. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are all red. Nevada stayed blue. Colorado stayed blue. So Colorado, Virginia, Nevada have all switched from mostly solid. They used to be solid red. Now they're solid blue, which that may be changing with Nevada becoming red this election cycle. Now, Trump opened up the map in this part of the country, and that's the big deal 16 years later, and now even 24 years later, is all these states used to be blue. All right, and now Florida is solid red. All right, Florida is solid red, so that's not a swing state anymore. So it's just interesting to see the dynamic of the voter base in America. There needs to be debate or on a podcast or moderated by top podcast reps. Imagine Rogan, Tucker, PBD as moderators. Yeah, see, that'd be amazing. What if Trump wins New York? I doubt Trump will win New York, but one of the things that I'm always telling people is that Trump is not campaigning in New York because he thinks he can flip the state, although maybe he does. Let me look at 2020 New York presidential election results. He's primarily campaigning to keep the House. Because if Trump doesn't win, if the Republicans don't keep the House of Representatives, it's not going to be good. Okay, so yeah, to me, very unlikely Trump flips New York. You want to know why? Because Biden won New York by over 20%, right? About 23%. And it's all because of New York City right here. Now, if we do precinct polls, and you guys, you can kind of see that, right? Can you see that on my screen? Yeah. So, I mean, now that's 2 million more votes. If Trump got 2 million more votes in New York, then yeah, he could flip the state. That's a lot to ask. 2 million votes. That's a pretty large margin because all of these red sections would need to go deep red. And then Long Island and New York City would have to go redder. Not saying it's impossible, but I think it's very unlikely, guys. I think it's very unlikely, in my personal opinion. And if we wanted to, we could look. So I wonder how he did in 2016. We can take a look. I'd be interested to know, how did Trump do in New York State in 2016? Let's look. Probably worse. Actually, he did better. Am I reading that right? In the blue state, it looks like he did better when he was going up against Hillary Clinton. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. And that's also when Republicans flipped the House too. So, I mean, geez, there you go. There you have it. So Trump actually did worse in New York City under Biden than he did against Hillary Clinton. And now he's going up against Kamala Harris. So newcomers are allowed to vote. House Speaker Johnson signed the bill yesterday. Oh, did he sign the bill? I didn't see that he signed the bill. He had enough votes. I haven't been keeping track on some of that information, but I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Trump got 10 million more votes in the second election and still lost. Give me a break. Yeah, I don't disagree. But if Trump wins New York, I mean, obviously it's game over. Yeah, okay, I see you, Chris. Let me stop sharing my screen. Yo, what's going on, Chris?
Hey, what's up, man?
I was gonna save you for this evening, but if you want to maybe briefly talk, because I was getting all these Fed questions. So I was like, yeah, we'll talk about that at 5. But if you want to briefly go over some big talking points that you think we saw over the weekend, let's talk about it. We got 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's all about liquidity. There's a guy, Michael Howell. He actually wrote this book. If anybody really wants to understand global liquidity, it's called Capital Wars: The Rise of Global Liquidity by Michael J. Howell. He also has a Substack as well that you can subscribe to monthly, where he's like the guy when it comes to global liquidity. And basically, since about the 90s, global liquidity is what's really driving asset prices overall. So that just happens to align with Bitcoin's halving, 4-year cycle, all these things. They all kind of align with that whole liquidity coming in. And so again, we talk about global liquidity. We're not just talking about U.S. liquidity. And so we're now entering into that next liquidity cycle right now. And so, the idea is that markets should generally tend to continue to trend upward as a result, because, again, you flood the market or you flood the economy with more capital, they got to put it somewhere. And so the U.S. being, having the USD, which is the world's reserve currency, whether we like it or not, it's going to bring in that excess capital, right? Excess production, because, that's just where it goes. It goes, everybody considers the U.S. market to be the safest market. They consider U.S. bonds to be the safest bonds, U.S. treasuries, pristine collateral is what they call it. So all of this kind of really bodes well for the U.S. just in general. But so right now we're kind of just now starting to enter that next liquidity cycle. That includes the big players, of course, of the U.S. and China.
Like, what is a liquidity cycle?
So a liquidity cycle is just where the governments actually go out there and they start, producing more fiat. They cut interest rates, which creates more credit. Well, it sets the stage to create more credit, right? Just because the government cuts interest rates doesn't mean that the banks have to loan money. And many times they won't just because of that. But it starts loosening. It starts giving them the ability to kind of loosen their requirements, right? So when the Fed goes and raises rates, the banks then kind of tighten their belt, so to speak, and all of a sudden you notice that you have to have a higher credit score, better credit, more things in order to get the kind of loans that you want to get as those the Fed rate goes up. And then as the Fed rate starts coming back down, the banks start loosening that. So there's two ways in which liquidity is created. One is the creation of what we call it, fiat, which is they're both done by the banks. Okay, when the Fed, for instance, prints more dollars, it doesn't go directly out there. It's against the law. It's against our law for the Fed to actually send us money directly. So it goes to the government, to do its funding, which then, of course, the government then sends money out, however it's spending its money, or it puts it in, gives it to the banks. I'm just keeping this really simple here. Then the banks then kind of, through fractional reserve banking, create more dollars from those dollars, so to speak. So there's two ways to do it. One is the Fed prints. The other one is that interest rates drop, which allows credit to increase. And so that's kind of, credit, of course, is all part of that whole, when the money goes to the banks, fractional reserve banking, all that kind of thing. So really that's what we're kind of getting into now. And so again, we look at, generally speaking, China, we look at the U.S., we look at Japan. These are kind of the big drivers of global liquidity. And so they've already started this. They've come into it. And of course, now the Fed doing its rate cut, which was pretty aggressive with the 50 point. I was looking for 25 basis point. That was really all they needed to do. I did mention that if they did happen to do 50, it would likely be because they felt maybe that they missed the opportunity to do 25 that they should have done back in July. And then Jerome Powell kind of came out and said as much. He said, we probably would have cut it back in, 25 back there in July if we'd had the jobs data. So, that's kind of where we're sitting right now. A lot of people have continued to call for, this bear market thing, this crash, this depression thing for the last couple of years. It hasn't happened yet. And, that doesn't mean they won't be right at some point. It's just not today, right? We look at September. Across the market, September seasonally is historically the worst month, whether you're in stocks or whether you're in crypto, Bitcoin and whatnot. Like I said, historically worst month. And we're actually up with the index, the S&P, we're up. And importantly, not even just the S&P, importantly is that the Dow has been leading this rally off of that August 5th pullback when everybody was all scared about the yen carry trade unwind. So the Dow's been leading, and that's important because the Dow is a much more broad-based index. So when you see the Dow rallying, what you're seeing is that more sectors across the market are actually rallying versus if you see the NASDAQ rallies just because tech is basically going, right? So you go, the NASDAQ is very, very tech heavy. The Dow is on the other side, is very diverse, very broad-based. And the S&P is kind of in the middle. The S&P still has a lot of tech in it, but it's more broad-based than what NASDAQ is. So usually, if you've got a good broad-based rally going on in the markets, what you'll see is the Dow will rally, and then the S&P will be behind it, and then the NASDAQ will usually be kind of trailing behind, which is what we're seeing right now. As a matter of fact, out of the three, the NASDAQ is the only one that hasn't hit a new all-time high yet. But it's a three-wave pullback. It's broken out above that second wave, so we should be seeing a new all-time high for the NASDAQ coming as well.
If you so what defines a new liquidity cycle? You're saying because the Fed cut rates, that means we're in a new liquidity cycle. Is that correct?
Well, it's what it is, right? So the liquidity is when we talk about liquidity cycles, what we're talking about is more fiat becoming available, more fiat entering the economy. Because when you have more fiat coming out there, well, now people have money sitting in their hands. What are they going to do with the money? Well, they're going to stick it usually in risk-on assets like stocks or crypto or something like that, versus just sitting there and holding it, right? Because now that the Fed's dropped the rate down there below 5%. Now, if you're a money market fund, all of a sudden those aren't looking so great anymore. They've been where people have been putting money because the rates have been so high. But now that you've started this rate cut cycle, now you got to go, okay, well, what are we going to do with this money? So you got 5-6 trillion whatever sitting over on the sidelines that could potentially at least a bit of that, quite a bit of that enter the markets just because again just looser money, looser policy out there as far as creation of more fiat.
Are there any other big notes that you think we should pay attention to or maybe research before we do our Twitter Spaces this evening?
I think it's kind of where we're at there. I think the dollar, the DXY probably, it looks like it may get a bounce or it's nearing ready to get a bounce for a bit. The indexes are looking kind of stretched at the moment, so we might see them pull back sooner rather than later. Usually the last 2 weeks of the month are the worst weeks actually out of the year for when it comes to stocks. The index is there. So, we're down to, like you said earlier, we've got about a week until the end of the month. So it's looking pretty good now, but I don't think there's anything kind of happening that says we're going to have a bad October or whatever. October is notoriously, the Q4 is notoriously really, really good for stocks and crypto. But as the very bearish out there will remind you, 1929, 1987, we saw the crashes happen in October. So, that's there. But, there's part of that whole, coming out of September into October. So usually if things are looking pretty good at the beginning of October, it usually ends up being a really good October, and then November and then December coming in. So it's really just kind of all about, the new rate cut cycle. Fed was a little bit aggressive coming into it, but did a good job being dovish enough about it that I think for the most part, the market, I think hopefully anyway, is understanding that the Fed isn't cutting because they're scared. They're just cutting because, hey, we should have cut 25 back in July, so we'll just go ahead and pump it up here, do the 50. But I've seen, some hedge funds coming out talking about, oh yeah, look, panic rate cut there by the Fed because it was so aggressive. It was a 50 right out of the box. So, that was what I was concerned about. That's what I mentioned would be the reason why we wouldn't want to see a 50, because people would think, no matter what it is, they would think, oh my God, the Fed's worried. The economy's not doing well. But the economy, jobs are doing just what the Fed's expecting right now. The economy continues, whether you want to believe it or not, continues to look strong. The numbers are coming out good. GDP is looking good. Jobs are coming up. But, again, I've talked about this so many times before. Historically, 5% has been considered 5% unemployment has been considered full-time employed or full employment for the country, between 4 and 6% there. And so, we went from 4 to 4.3 back down to 4.2. I don't see how we hit a recession based on, the real extremes of full employment in the economy. It
Gotcha.
doesn't make any sense. But yeah, other than that, just the same things we've talked about, which is that the jobs market in the economy itself really are different. This time they are different coming out of the pandemic than what they were prior to the pandemic. And so I think that makes a big difference in the way that we look at things now versus the way we've kind of always looked at them.
Got it. Okay. All right, guys. Well, if you want to hear more about that kind of stuff, you'll have to come to our Twitter Spaces at 5. Chris, thanks for hopping on, even just briefly, because that I now have a whole list of questions that I'm going to ask you later on. So that's really useful for me.
I always get to jump on here, man.
Yeah, seriously. Thank you, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, Twitter Spaces 5 o'clock today. We'll see you then. Thanks for hanging out.